On today's World Insight, relations going down the pits with America's top diplomat casting doubts on engagement with China, the state of unraveling ties from a respected U.S. voice on China.
What the costs of bad U.S.-China relations can be, and they can be enormous.
And harsh lessons on what went wrong with the global COVID-19 response and the stumbling blocks in vaccine research. The Lancet's editor-in-chief, Richard Horton, with direct answers.
And that sense of anti-science is a huge danger to the health and well-being of our people.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Last Thursday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivered a speech trying to seek an end to the long-held engagement policy with China. It's yet another straw that's breaking the back of China-U.S. relations. Both sides have carried out tit-for-tat measures recently, the closing of consulates, restricting visas, and new rules on diplomatic travel, as well as expelling foreign correspondents. Could bilateral relations get any worse? I asked that question to David Lampton, one of the most respected voices on China from the U.S. He's also the former president of National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. He said some of the U.S. decisions are just the latest in an extended line of self-defeating moves that will weaken America's infrastructure of global cultural influence. Let's take a listen. Now joining us, David Lampton. David Lampton is a professor emeritus from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies on China Studies. He's also former president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. What a pleasure, Professor Lampton, to see you after at least more than half a year.
Yes, it's good to be with you, Tian Wei, and I look forward to the opportunity to come to China when we get all these health problems straightened away.
Be safe and sound with you and your family. Let me start by asking you about your latest article regarding the Fulbright scholar and the scrap-out of the program here in China. You argued that Trump's decision will not only hurt Hong Kong and erode U.S. cultural influence as well. Tell me more about exactly what you meant, Professor.
Well, I think there are three forms of power, broadly speaking. There's coercive military power, there's economic power, and there's what we might call the power of persuasion, soft power. China talks a lot about soft power, and over the last 2 decades, you've done considerable work to try and increase China's soft power. Well, the Fulbright program, which was founded in 1947, in the United States. The United States came out of World War II and wanted to build relations with as many nations as possible and thought American universities and professors and students both going abroad to exchange knowledge and to bring foreign students, scholars, researchers, and language teachers to the United States would increase American soft power. But more than just soft power and international competition, I think Americans believe, and I certainly believe, that attracting the best brains in the world helps American innovation and us to be a more productive society. So I would say the two big reasons are peace and prosperity.
Let's take a look at the numbers, because the numbers sometimes tell us a lot about the facts. Up to 390,000 Fulbrighters came from all over 160 countries and regions since the program began in 1947 in the United States. Records show of the total number of participants in 2017, 175 are from the Chinese mainland and 19 are from Hong Kong of China. And the number may not be high, but there is many other similar programs for exchanges. We have seen Peace Corps, for example, In the last 25 years, more than 1,300 American volunteers have completed their 2-year assignments at more than 140 universities and colleges across China. Peter Hessler is only one of those examples, author of Rivertown, and Evan Osnos, an American journalist from The New Yorker, both joined this program. These are just the sporadic cases out of a huge group. Now, in China, Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University is operated a little differently. In the class of 2020, it has students from 38 countries with 40% from the United States, a fifth from China, 40% from the rest of the world. We also have the Yanjing scholars with the Peking University as well. Professor, what I want to say is, are we going to see a U.S. ever more withdrawing from its engagement, both with China and the rest of the world, and China apparently very active to engage with the United States and also the other countries?
Well, I think I would answer your question by saying no, I do not think we will see that for a long period in the future. In other words, the difficulties we're having now, I hope and I believe, are going to be, in retrospect, unfortunate period, but not the main historical trend. But I would say something that's more important. It's one thing for me to say I'm optimistic or not. I'm optimistic about the future. But one strength I believe the United States has is not everything here depends on the central government. In fact, not everything depends on local government. And in the educational realm, it's a particularly decentralized situation here. So, for example, the first time I went to do research for 6 months in China in 1982, I went to Wuhan University, which had a school-to-school relationship with my university called Ohio State University. And as far as I would know, the federal or central government had virtually nothing to do with that. There are hundreds and hundreds of bilateral university-to-university agreements. My own school of Johns Hopkins has had for 30-plus years a center that at Nanjing University that it runs in joint partnership, and I trust and hope it will be successful for another 30 years. Similarly, my school, SAIS, Johns Hopkins here, has a program with Tsinghua in which SAIS students go to Tsinghua. Tsinghua students come to SAIS. They've been some of the best students that both schools have. So I would say while the direction of what you might call federal policy, our central government policy, is very unfortunate, I would say indeed reckless. Mercifully, the U.S. doesn't depend entirely on its central government. And as long as American universities and other educational institutions see opportunities in China to gain mutual benefit, they will continue unless the central government prohibits it. And my guess is that the central government, short of conflict between our two nations, would not do that.
But Professor Lampton, as long as the federal government does not prevent it from happening, that is exactly what happened when this administration trying to put an end of international students in the United States in the name of the pandemic. Of course, the universities fought back, and they were brave. But there could be other waves.
And they won.
And they won, yes, indeed, they won.
They won.
They won.
That's my point.
But
they won.
People here are very concerned. Some of the mini surveys I've been talking to professors here in Chinese universities whose students are actually aspire to go to the United States to study or to understand the culture, now consider that option either dangerous or has to be postponed for unforeseeable future. So this is the reality we are seeing right now. Atmosphere could become very cold quite fast, Professor.
Right, but this, I think, reflects a number of things. Of course, first of all, the pandemic is making international travel very unpredictable.
Sure.
It's being compounded by, I would say, certain visa restrictions, at least on certain categories of students. So that is a federal problem, and there's not much universities can do about it. But the long and the short of it is Chinese students are now, and I would say from India, secondarily Taiwan, South Korea, but prominently China, Chinese students in American universities are extremely important along a number of dimensions. One is they help the university be more global. Chinese students and many from Asia bring math, engineering, science skills that unfortunately not as many Americans as should be the case want to study. Chinese students therefore are important to our science departments in conducting laboratories and experiments. Many Chinese and Indian and students from throughout Asia stay on, not necessarily indefinitely, but for a period of time, and establish companies, often with firms back in China or India for that matter. So what I'm trying to say is there is a very big constituency for higher education exchange. The government sometimes has its policies that the universities or educational institutions do not agree with. But in the long run, American universities and the educational establishment have a huge clout. The intellectual talent coming from all over the world is important to us, and in the end, I believe that will prevail. But this government, that is the Trump administration, has been unique in the degree to which it has tried to impede this domain. And you know, I think our government had such a weak case on prohibiting students from coming that they pulled the case from court about a few hours before it was to begin, knowing they would lose.
A lot of people do not necessarily understand the significance of academic exchanges, the significance of student exchanges, and cultural exchanges. Maybe you could tell us about your personal story that would enlighten us about how we have managed after decades of efforts to be where we are today, at least between China and the United States. Professor, I know you were in Hong Kong and then on the mainland. Tell me more about that.
Well, the first time that I went to, we'll call it Greater China, was in 1972-73 as a Fulbright scholar. I went to Hong Kong to interview Chinese people, many of whom during the Cultural Revolution and earlier in history had gone to Hong Kong. And American scholars such as myself could not go to China. It was prohibited by our government. My first passport had a list of prohibited countries, one of which was the People's Republic of China. So the nearest I could get to China to study it and talk to Chinese people was in Hong Kong. I learned a lot. It was about, I did a study, it was my dissertation, became a book on the politics of medicine in China. And what I believed and what I believe now is, of course, it's important what our central leaders do, whether it's Donald Trump or President Xi or whatever. Central leaders matter. But when I went into the field, everybody was studying central leaders and central party meetings. And my view was that how governments meet the basic needs of their people at the grassroots level is a very important part of politics. And therefore, I wanted to look how it was that a relatively poor China in 1972-73 was able to provide a much better level of public health for its people than many other developing countries at a similar income level. And China, over time, did a very good job. And I wanted to tell the story about how China managed to have a better health circumstance than it had in many other regards. So I believe you need to walk on two intellectual legs. One is you need to understand the top of society, but you also need to understand where government meets society at the grassroots level. And the only place I could, at that time, really find out the kind of information and personal experience was by interviewing people in Hong Kong.
Very interesting experience. And then, a few years later, you struggled your way into China, the People's Republic of China, which you said on the page of your passport was very long time being forbidden. 1976, Professor.
I was a part of a science group that was going to China to talk about steroid chemistry.
Yeah.
Steroid chemistry has at that time had a lot to do with birth control pills and birth control policy. And I went with the National Academy of Sciences group because I was one of the few Americans who had looked at China's medical system, as I just explained when I was in Hong Kong. So the National Academy, our National Academy of Sciences, asked me to join this group, and we went to China in 1976. But we had to enter China a month after Mao had passed away. China at that particular time, and this always left a deep impression on me, the transition to the next generation of leaders was not yet clear. And as we traveled around China from Beijing down to Guilin to Shanghai, the new transition, new power structure gradually emerged. So I've always felt that I saw China firsthand, and I think that's one of the things that I think maybe younger people in both of our countries do not fully appreciate. And that is how expensive our conflict, China and America's conflict, were in the 1950s and 60s. And we've had 40 years of peace, rapid economic growth. Both of our countries have improved. And the long and the short of it is that engagement for both of our people has been a tremendous success. It's had problems all along. It has serious problems now, I think the worst problem since 1972. But our younger people ought to appreciate what the costs of bad U.S.-China relations can be. Enormous.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing that part of the experience and your insight about history. But people could say, well, you know, Professor Lampton, those stories are old. Those stories are coming out of the time when China and the United States were hand in hand, or at least in the process of coming hand in hand. But now, look at the situation has dramatically changed, and therefore your story does not provide any of the reference to us anymore, some would argue, Professor Lampton.
Well, I'm sure you're correct, and young people always have the sort of to come to terms with in what respect do we pay attention to the experience of our elders, and to what extent do we look at a new situation with new means at our disposal and adapt to the new situation, even if it isn't fully consistent with what an older generation might have done. I guess I call that the process of living. But I think we all know that there is some role for experience. Yeah. And I think anybody who has that response would just or who might think in the way you described should ask themselves, during the Cold War between the United States and China, where, from the United States point of view and from China's viewpoint, what were the two biggest wars of the Cold War? And the answer was Korea and Vietnam. And they both those wars involved China as well as, in the one case, Korea and the other, Vietnam. In the 40 years plus after normalization, we've had no wars or conflict. That doesn't mean we won't in the future. It doesn't mean that we don't have serious problems now, which some people are very, I would say, immoderate about. But I think the idea that war is expensive is something that's become increasingly true. During the Cold War, we only had nuclear weapons, basically, and obviously conventional weapons. But now there are many other ways in which we each can hurt each other. We can disrupt each other's supply chains. We can interrupt our educational relations. We can interrupt cyber connections upon which we're both so dependent. So I would say that my experience, yes, is old, but the wisdom of avoiding conflict is even more profound now, perhaps, than it was in the 1950s and 60s.
You talk about the young people. I'm afraid that, Professor Lampton, I have to remind you, many of those who are talking about this Cold War mentality are not necessarily young people inside the United States, but rather some of those policymakers in their 70s and 60s. And some suggest that there is a danger of applying the Cold War mentality, particularly the playbook against the former Soviet Union now, to China by the United States. What do you make of that discussion?
Well, I agree with pretty much what you said, and that is that no generalization is perfect. And my statement about younger people did not mean to apply to all younger people, because young people have a variety of views in both our countries as well. And certainly I would not suggest that older people can't have very counterproductive foreign policy views. I think if you look at the upper echelons of Washington, you'll find quite a few people my age with my color hair. And they're not all pursuing a very wise course, and as you would say, have the Cold War playbook firmly in mind. But I think you're going to see that the U.S. is a resilient society. Winston Churchill had a statement, I think, about Americans. And of course, Churchill had ties to the United States, family ties. He says, you know, I love the Americans. They are always right after they exhaust every other possibility. In short, we're capable of making a lot of mistakes. And frankly, I would say China is too. But we have corrective mechanisms. And I may be wrong, but I think you're going to see a very great display of a corrective mechanism on November 3rd.